Fabulous students! Hello, welcome back for another online lecture. In this one, let's kick off with starting about writing for newspapers. I can tell you that you will see with newspapers that the contributing writers, the editors that work within the realm of fashion are always there for an exceptionally long time. So I don't want to say a relatively plum gig, but it comes with a great amount of, notoriety and prestige. And you have to really be able to disseminate between, opinion and fact, and also be able to give criticism. And so in this capacity, when you are a journalist and you write fashion for a newspaper, if you give a critique of a runway show and you give it an unfavorable review, you can be expected to not be invited to that designer show the following season. It's just kind of how it goes, but it seems like those talented fashion journalists that write for newspapers have the gumption and the will to do these things and don't care if they get banned from attending next season's Giorgio Armani show, which happened to the New York Times editor-reporter Kathy Horn for a number of seasons, that Mr. Armani absolutely refused to extend an invite to her, and other designers have banned her and other journalists as well, based on them giving them an unfavorable review in the paper, which just goes to show you, the important weight that fashion writing in newspapers does hold. As much as we're a society that, revels in the online nature and are moving in that direction, newspapers are still the most, common, widespread medium. And so, word really spreads quickly via newspaper. It's amazing, the readership and how many people read it. And now, with more accessibility worldwide, thanks to publications translating, their articles onto online, there's even more influence available there. And so, it's something to consider if you're serious about becoming a fashion writer, if writing for a newspaper might be the direction that you want to go in. There's been plenty of famous writers that have stayed at the New York Times in particular for decades upon decades, Bill Cunningham being one of them. And so we'll do a little bit more and talk a bit more about him as the weeks go on, because he is a major influential person in the realm of newspaper writing, trend, style, society, all that kind of thing. And he's an octogenarian and still working. You'll still see him around New York, around Midtown. He's commonly spotted at 57th and 5th. And also outside of the Fashion Week venue, and sometimes inside. And he's a bit of an anomaly because he is one of the few photographers, or only photographer possibly, that is still shooting on film, developing it, and publishing it in the paper instead of, shooting with a digital camera. So it's just such an interesting person, and there'll be none like him, once he's gone. But yeah, someone that you definitely want to know is the name Bill Cunningham, and also be able to identify him by his bright blue nylon jacket and occasionally on a bike. So I digress. Apologies. Back to writing about newspapers. If this is something that you do want to try out or are interested in, there's some ways that are a bit easier than others to break into it. Overall, you'll have to have a really great comprehension for the style guide, and grammar and mechanics and all that stuff that I talked about in the prior lecture, because with newspapers, all that stuff is supposed to be perfect and kept super duper tight. And it does have its own tone to it as well. So you have to really make sure you nail down the mechanics as well. So one way that you can kind of break into it that might be a little bit easier than most is if you start to kind of look at newspaper options that are hyper-local. So by hyper-local, I mean, does the neighborhood you live in have a newspaper? Is there a local center or organization that puts out a newspaper or a newsletter that you can gain experience writing to? In many of these cases, especially in New York City, the answer will be yes. In smaller places, you might have to dig a little deeper, but granted, there is going to be some sort of press, some sort of newspaper that you would be able to write for that's more regional. And so with that being said, some of them may be like on a volunteer basis, so they may not be paying gigs, but it may help you to garner some experience when you're starting off in writing. And so sometimes being able to put something on your resume or start to be a portfolio builder is a little bit more valuable than the money that you would have possibly made off of the piece anyway. Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to newspaper writing is the word count. And so this is one of those things where if you are getting paid per word or you're getting paid a certain amount for a newspaper article, and it's for, let's say, like $300 for 500 words. Well, if you go over and you write, let's say, 600 words, that doesn't mean you're going to make more money. All it means is that you're just going to make your editor aggravated because he or she is going to have to cut it down to 500 words. And those word counts exist because they relate directly to the space allotment that at which, the newspaper or publication has built out for that piece. So it's crucial that you stick very tightly, very closely to the designated word count on your piece. Very important. Moving forward. So we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about how to write a fashion-related article for a newspaper, and not necessarily focus on, in this talk, the role of newspapers in fashion journalism or how the newspaper industry is changing. So I kind of gave you a little bit of a synopsis of that already. But to think a little bit about some of the newspaper articles that you guys have read or you might read, part of your assignment will relate to this. But thinking about the differences that, this one article assignment might have if it was in a print publication for a newspaper or if it was found online, or if it was in print and had to be translated to online, what might some of the differences be? And usually the content itself may stay in its original form once it moves from print to online. However, some of the modes of enticement may change. So there may be different visuals used online opposed to print, and the title and subheads may change as well. So they've obviously been done for a reason. The original reason was probably a space constraint, but also to think about the target audience and the demographic that might be reading the paper in a print form versus an online form. And keywords, that may be used to attract these different kinds of readers to those pieces. So just something to keep in mind as you continue to read and write, and we're going into the newspaper chapter. So just a quick overview. We have two different formats for newspaper articles that generally fit into either news stories or feature articles. So feature articles are things that can be planned out in advance. Usually a traditional lead time for a newspaper can be 2 weeks, unless it's more of an in-depth article that requires, more lengthy research. And news stories are exactly that, things that are happening that are very of the moment. And so I can tell you in my experience that writing a feature article can be a blessing and a curse. A blessing because you can have, an extended amount of time. You can have a deadline, that's a little bit further in the future instead of something that you have to do immediately. And so you can really spend some quality time on it, getting quotes, procuring images, all that stuff. And it can be a little bit more of a fun topic that is evergreen. And so by evergreen, I'm not sure if you've ever heard that term before, but it's an important one to know in the realm of fashion writing. And so, or really writing in general if you're pitching a story. And so, for me personally, I really try to pitch features that are more evergreen so that I have more flexibility in their deadlines, because I work about 6 different jobs at times, so it's a little nuts and I need to coordinate it all. And so evergreen basically means that your piece is not a news story. It's not really like of the moment newsworthy. There may be somewhat of a soft deadline in which it should be completed. Like, for example, if I'm doing a feature on summer sandals, I'd really want to have that feature up by the middle of the summer. I wouldn't want to have it ready to be published the last week of August. So some of them, the deadlines are there, but a little hazy. But overall, evergreen features are great because an editor can hold on to them and kind of use them as a filler piece for whenever there's some space or, content that they thought were going to come up falls through. So it's really great to kind of pitch these evergreen pieces to editors and to write them. The downside of it is that, one, you might not know when it'll be published because they may hold on to it, and because it's not timely, it doesn't mean that it'll be published right away or anytime soon. Two, if you do have an evergreen piece, a feature article that may have been slated for a certain deadline or date to run, to publish, and then something super duper newsworthy happens, you better believe that you're going to get bumped. And so this is the same thing that happens if you're doing like a fashion segment for a TV, is that you usually get, especially if you're doing like the news, you get like a 2-minute slot in which you get to speak about a certain subject. And so let's say you're doing, your fashion piece on like summer trends or something like that. If there's something crazy happening in the news that's going to consume a lot of the time that is newsworthy, your piece is going to get bumped. So it's just one thing to keep in mind is that, when something does come up that is important, that is newsworthy, the evergreen pieces or the featured articles become less important. So editors do love evergreen pieces, though. So I would recommend thinking about ways that you can kind of formulate your own evergreen pieces. And I think the best thing to do is to kind of keep your eyes out onto the pulse of what's happening in fashion. Trends or roundups of products are always a good thing to kind of go in an evergreen direction with. So just start to formulate some options that you might feel would be evergreen in your own time. We can do some exercises with this in the future as well, but it's a good practice to get in to try to think about that. And whenever you pitch articles as well, you have to remember to do your homework. You don't necessarily want to pitch an article to an editor that they just ran last week or recently ran. So what a good rule of thumb to do is, and which I always do, is before I send anything in to an editor as a potential feature idea, I always will look at the magazine or scan the website and see if there's anything similar that had been published recently. And if there was something that had been published recently, I'll skip the idea. Or if it's been published years ago, I may go with the idea, but then just say, hey, I saw that you wrote an article on this in 2010. I was thinking of maybe making it a little bit more enhanced and updated and doing X, Y, and Z. What do you think? So you not only show that you've done your homework, but also that you're thinking of ways to further evolve the piece. So definitely get bonus points for that. I would definitely recommend giving that a try with your pitches. And don't forget to do your research and your homework before you send any ever. So, going back to newspapers, we talked about the formats of the news stories and feature articles. And then moving forward, talks about how newspapers are broken into categories, and these categories are derived on how frequently they publish, if it's daily, weekly, monthly, or quarterly. So most newspapers are daily. Even though Women's Wear Daily has daily as part of the name, it actually is only published 5 days a week, and then on the weekends, very, very seldom is there an extra issue published. And so, for example, around Fashion Week, there will always be an extra weekend issue published because it's such a big deal in the industry that 2 days full of shows, that can be like 30, 40 shows, that it would be hard to skip that or compile it all into Monday because by then it's kind of old news in a way. So it's important to know how frequently the magazines are published, and also if you are pitching stories to kind of consider that in your pitches. If the kind of sections that they have and where your feature might possibly fit in it when you're pitching an idea. So I know I mentioned this before, but the Wall Street Journal has fashion-related features always on Thursdays and over the weekend. And you would want to specifically address the editor that, oversees this section as well as that particular category. So, for example, on the weekend, it's the off-duty section of the paper. During the week, on Thursday, it's the personal journal. And so you'd want to get closer to finding out who the editor of that section is and who might be responsible for the style section when sending in your pitches. Okay, so moving forward, further differences in the categories. We have consumer magazines and newspapers. There's special interest newspapers and there's trade newspapers. So Women's Wear Daily is considered a trade newspaper, oftentimes referred to as the Bible of the industry. I'm sure you guys have heard that 5,000 times. But it's a very crucial piece of, history. It's, dates back very long time, and is what is heavily relied upon and looked to in fashion. If you get your collection reviewed or get published in WWD, it is a big deal. And so, the consumer is looking, to other types of newspapers for the most part. And I think you know what the big national newspapers are. So again, newspaper, be it consumer or trade, being such an esteemed source, that you really want to make sure that you report with all accuracy. And so you want to make sure that, you quote people correctly, the facts have been double-checked and verified, that, you look to things like public and private records for data, that you do your best to ensure that you're telling the story with the utmost of accuracy to your knowledge. And so with print, it's a lot harder these days that if a publication, needs to make a correction, it's going to have to print it in the next edition. It's not so easy as online to just edit something. So because of that, it's really important that the first time around you get everything in pretty correctly. And so there's a checklist on page 86 that cements the ways that you can double check to make sure that you ensure accuracy. And you shouldn't just do this in newspaper writing, but you should do it in paper writing and everything that you can. And so it notes that you should identify your sources, which include names, and state why these people are appropriate as authorities. So I can quote anybody on anything, but will it really have validity unless they're specific to the topic at hand? No, probably not. So it's important that you get the right people for the right kind of feature to quote. On the checklist as well is to admit ignorance or uncertainty. So if you don't know something, admit it instead of speculating or creating a scenario in which the readers think that you know what is going on. Quote only what you personally have heard. Secondhand information is not reliable, so do not quote what you have not heard. So basically that goes to say that, firsthand interviews, that you should quote from people that you interviewed, and then you should also cite what style of interview that took place over. So for example, if your subject responded via email, you should say that. If it was an in-person interview, you should say that. If it was over the phone, you should say that. Moving on, you should reconstruct cautiously. So when reconstructing a meeting or a conversation as a narrative, be sure that it represents what occurred, not something you wish had occurred. And also, when you reiterate or paraphrase quotes, you have to be very careful about this too. You'll see in a quote, you'll see a ... and that basically means that a section of that quote was cut out and then picks up later. So you have to make sure, with the ... or some way you delineate that there was a break, in the sentence, a break in the thought of the person that you're quoting. And last, it says check multiple sources. This will give you a wide range of viewpoints and will help you confirm that the information is consistent. So, we have Google for a reason, so don't be afraid to use it to double check the same fact, and don't just go to the first website that pops up. Go to a few others just to double check your source. Another thing that I can tell you about accuracy and writing, which can apply to newspapers, but overall, is that you should never make a promise to anybody that anything will be published and what will be published and in what capacity. Because as a writer, you can write your piece and you can have control over what you submit, but you don't have any control over what gets published most of the time. So you don't know what the editor is going to cut or add or change. You don't know when the piece will run, and you also don't know if it'll ever run. There's always that possibility that it'll be killed off and it'll never make its way to print. So if someone that you speak with wants you to quote them and they say, okay, I'll talk about this if you promise me that this brand name is mentioned, or if you promise me that this model is mentioned, or that it'll link to my website, or something like that. Unless it's your own site, your blog that you have full ownership over, don't ever promise that anything will happen, because you really don't know. And so, people get into trouble over this kind of thing because they make promises that they really can't fulfill. So it's just one thing to be wary of that you should never do. Okay, so continuing on, I mentioned this in a previous lecture, but the inverted pyramid is here, in which it talks about the most important information being arranged in the beginning of the feature and in the beginning of the paragraph. And so you rank the important facts in order of most to least. And so starting in with the lead, which is the who, what, where, when of the feature, and then as you move on, the weight, the importance of the information goes down as you move along. So there are some modifications that you can make besides the straightforward inverted pyramid order for kind of compiling and putting together your feature. And there's only a few that we're going to focus on in class. Overall, it's the anecdotal, chronological order, foreshadowing, flashbacks, narration, exposition, formatting that you can use. And so I think that the anecdotal is one that you will frequently come across in your reading of newspaper articles. And the anecdotal structure allows the writer to concentrate on an individual or group that represents a bigger population. And so usually what will happen is that this kind of article will start with a quote or something that is a little bit more interesting, engaging way to transition into the piece. The Wall Street Journal frequently employs this, and so it'll kind of give in a more engaging setup of a way to start off the piece. So again, it won't necessarily have the most important information at the front. It'll kind of leave you with a taste of what it might be about, but wanting more. And so the wanting more part is where it transitions into the nut paragraph from the opening. And so there it expects you to make a connection between the intro example that might be a little bit more eye-catching and appealing into the story's theme and what it's really about. Then you move through the rest of the story, the feature, and at the end, usually the anecdotal structure ends with a quote. This also happens quite a bit in the New York Times, is a very popular structure to use. And so usually it goes back to somebody or the idea that was first introduced in the beginning. So it kind of brings the feature full circle after the details of what the article is about has been provided, so that it's a nice kind of closing piece. And you don't really have to write more of a formal conclusion in that sense. So you may be all about the anecdotal structure. The next one is the chronological order, and it's pretty much exactly as you would expect. It moves through the subject of the feature from the beginning to the end. And so, within that chronological order, you may not get to the important information until a bit later. So it's not really the inverted pyramid structure that, is originally talked about as traditional for for newspapers. With the chronological order, you have to really remember that you could lose people along the way because they might be thinking, what is the point of this? When we'll get to the point? When will it bring things up to speed? So you have to be well aware of editing it down to just the most important aspects of it that you want to relay to the reader. So it may not be a chronological order of every single little thing that happened, but highlighting the more important things. So another example of a newspaper article could be foreshadowing, which is a way to kind of hint without giving away all the information about what might be coming up. So from a fashion perspective, you could do it to review a fashion documentary or a fashion-related book you read or something like that. But, if you give away all the information, why would someone want to go out and buy the book? Well, maybe they would if they don't really like or trust your opinion. But, it's basically like you want to give a little tease, but you don't want to give the whole spoiler away of the whole entire plot. So it's definitely a skill to write it in a foreshadowing piece. And so it's something that, again, you'll probably want to practice and read how others have done it. And I've read some that have been so hysterical and witty, and, done so well that it has convinced me this movie really isn't worth seeing, or this book sounds amazing. I would never think that I'd have any interest in it, but it sounds incredible. Take note of the features that may be from a foreshadowing technique that you're intrigued with, and maybe place them somewhere. Send them to yourself to keep a copy of it as a good example of a foreshadowing piece. Alrighty, next up is talking about writing headlines. According to Timothy Kelly, when you are writing headlines, you should use the present tense and always use short active verbs. So, for example, in the book it says, you don't need to say celebrities seek rehab after drunken episodes and bigoted rants, when you can say, Britney needs help. You don't need to write exactly the same thing as you write in your news lead. That's wasting a chance to draw readers in. And so it's very true that, especially in newspaper writing, it's not really as much about romanticizing, the feature, but really about getting right to the crux of the piece. And so you really need to do a good job of summarizing your article and giving it a straightforward name so that the reader knows what to expect and it's delivered upon by the time that they finish that particular article. And so depending on, again, the newspaper that you write for, some might be a little bit more serious than others. Some may have a little bit more of a playful slant, but all within keeping of the realm of, still telling the reader enough of what, the feature is about for their expectations to be met. I'm sure that you guys have probably seen the New York Post or heard of the New York Post. But their headlines are always so sensational and so funny. And that's kind of what they're known for, and they don't really report hard news necessarily. They have celebrity news and stuff that will make a splashy appearance on the front page. But it's always full of double entendres and just a really fun, good example of ways to think about headlines and creativity when it comes to writing. I'm not saying go and pick up an issue and read it front to back as an example of stellar journalism. However, I am saying that look at their headlines for some inspiration every now and then and a laugh as well. And so, moving ahead. In the rest of the newspaper chapter, it goes into some trends in the industry, and it features another checklist for revising your article. And as you'll see, it's not really unlike the revisions that you make that we've talked about in the writing process in the previous lecture. So just to kind of, hit the idea home, let's just go over a few of them. So some of the guidelines for making an effective article revision include taking a break and coming back to it, reading your article out loud, double checking to make sure if the sequence of ideas are clear. So that could also have to do with the formatting that you use. Maybe if you did it in chronological order, you might want to play with it in an anecdotal sense or go back to the inverted pyramid. So maybe that's a better way, to rearrange it to try to get a little bit more clarity into your piece. Of course, and as always, put yourself in your reader's shoes to make sure that your words couldn't be misconstrued as something else. Make sure that the article you've written seems to contain words that are important and that aren't superfluous. Double check your paragraphing and make sure that you do have paragraph breaks in there and that they're appropriate. And again, use spell checkers, but do not rely on just this, because otherwise your piece might not come out as good as it can if you wouldn't have looked over it or someone else would have looked over it for you. I'd like to read you a bit from an article that Interview Magazine did with Kathy Horn. This is while she was still the fashion critic at the New York Times. And her previous experience includes the Detroit News and Washington Post. This was a contributing editor at Vanity Fair. Her first job was being at the Portsmouth, Virginia School Board for the paper, the Norfolk Ledger Star. So see what I tell you, more specific local regional papers can really help launch your career. Horn has had a career that has spanned several decades, and she really stands out in the crowd amongst other fashion critics. She doesn't ever claim to be a fashion insider or, a lover of all things when it comes to fashion, but, I think that it lends her a great perspective because her view is kind of journalism first. Journalism trumps all. And there are different requirements for a reporter when it comes to newspapers versus magazines. And so a lot of that can come under play with kind of gifting, gifting of dinners, gifting of objects, all these things. When you are at a newspaper, you have to stick to a very strict code. in which you're not really allowed to accept anything or much. And there's a dollar monetary cutoff point at which you definitely cannot accept things, because what the reason why it's in place to keep to keep the critics, to keep the journalists bias free, so that they don't have anything that pops into their mind that may make them be favorable towards one person or company or anything like that. So it's a pretty good rule of thumb. And so this interview is by Stephen Moalem, and I'm just going to read you a little bit of it, since it pertains quite nicely to what we're working on here. Stephen Moalem: describe the landscape of fashion journalism when you were starting out. What kind of world were you coming into? Kathy Horn: I would say that there was very little criticism in 1986. That was the main thing. Bernadine Morris was in place at the New York Times, and she would give people a gentle slap if she didn't like something, or she'd ignore it. Nina Hyde was at the Washington Post, and she was very much a reporter. She had close associations with a lot of designers and was very interested in the process of fashion and the making of clothes. But there wasn't really a critical voice. There was Kennedy Frazier at the New Yorker. I don't know if Kennedy was still writing for the New Yorker in 1986, but her writing certainly had a big impact on me, as well as the New Yorker way of taking a little bit more distance, but also being critical of things. So that was something that I noticed. Also, people wrote in much more detail. They really described the clothes and the collections. They were very conscious of their reader back in Detroit or Washington or Atlanta. That person wanted to know what was happening and maybe wasn't seeing Elsa Clench on CNN. Then, of course, there were a lot of buyers there from the specialty stores and the big department stores. So you did a mix of interviewing the buyers and going to the collections. I was way too far down the totem pole to even think about going to see the European designers. I don't even remember going backstage for the first couple of years. But even though the process of transmitting stories was more cumbersome, you still had more time. You had time to go shopping. They used to serve lunch at the Fiera in Milan. The designers basically bought the lunch. It was like a meal ticket situation, a buffet lunch. But it was an amazing lunch. All the journalists would be there, as well as a lot of the buyers, and you'd really get to know people. That's where I first met Susie Menkes, so you could take time and talk. Stephen Moalem: what about how you were writing about fashion? How did you begin to think about that? Kathy Horn: well, I was already writing critically the Detroit News, but when I went to the Washington Post in 1990, the style section there at the time was a real kick-ass place. Whether it was Tom Shales or Paul Richards doing art criticism, or Paul Hendrickson doing feature stories, or Martha Sherrill doing features, everybody had a point of view. So it was a natural place to be a critic. Washington is also always about the conversation, whether it's about politics or the Redskins, or fashion or the social world. And people don't necessarily need to know the details. They don't need to buy the clothes. They just want to be informed. So I think I got to be aware that people were not interested in the details of the clothes as much. They want you to tell them what you thought and what does it mean, and why should I care? So you didn't necessarily have to dwell, in the obligatory sense, on covering every collection, although I sometimes feel like I did. But you could be more selective about it. And of course, jump ahead 20 years, and I'm very selective about what I write about, and whom I write about, and how much I write about somebody. Stephen Moalem: do you think that the person-to-personness of fashion back then also had something to do with the fact that it was still more a traditionally entrepreneurial business? Kathy Horn: probably. I used to think that the great years for covering fashion were the 1960s, and not because of the miniskirt. It was because of New York. I always thought it would be great to do a book on that period, from 1962 or 63 up to 73. You could do a kind of crazy book that looked at the lives of Bill Blass, Oscar de la Renta, Halston, Jeffrey Bean, Jacques Defoe, who was a very important designer in New York in the 60s and a real wild man, but with incredible taste. And then you could look at the people who came along, like Eugenia Shepherd and Diana Vreeland, and the lives of certain retailers who were important, and the money guys like Ben Shaw, because the 60s in America were all about the big manufacturers. Then you have the 70s, which is really about the big entrepreneurial bust out. You've got Calvin Klein and Barry Schwartz starting up. Oscar is now running his own shop. Bill Blass is expanding into all those licenses. You've got the Europeans doing the same thing, and the Valentinos and the Saint Laurent. There was also less marketing involved. I won't say it was about more creative stuff. It was just that the assumption was that it was creative. You didn't need to put brackets around the designers who were conceptual or ironic or postmodern. There was an actuality about everything, and by that I mean that it just was. There was always smoke and mirrors in fashion, but back then you went in to see a line, and there it was. Stephen Moallem. So when did things start to change? Kathy Horn. When I got to Vanity Fair in 1995, I was still writing about fashion, but I was also writing about Hollywood and music, so I wasn't paying as much attention. Then I came to the New York Times and at the end of 1998, so I started covering the collections again in 99, and at that point, the entire industry was in transition with the emergence of Gucci Group and PPR and LVMH and Richemont. They were acquiring all these houses. So there was this bigger, sharper branding approach to fashion, which I also think is interesting. It's not bad or good, it's just different. Stephen Moallem. So for you, what are some of the big storylines in fashion right now? Kathy Horn. Well, one of the big ones is going to be the influence or the impact that Ralph Simons at Dior has on the other aspects of the industry, and possibly also at the contemporary fashion level. We saw what happened when he started doing color at Joe Sander. That it had an almost immediate effect of injecting far more color into the industry. It was a simultaneous thing, with some of the jeans makers also getting in, but those guys were looking at ready-to-wear, the jeans makers have told me that. So I think Rafe is going to have a pretty interesting impact on ready-to-wear, and people are going to look at what he does. I think Heidi Slimane over at YSL is going to be interesting to watch too. ... Then you have China. There are a lot of Chinese American designers and Chinese designers who have had an impact a little bit on the American market, but I think it's going to be interesting to watch if, over time, somebody can emerge from China who is based in China, and whether they come and show in Paris like Rei Kawakubo or Yohji Yamamoto did. I think Paris will still be the anchor for all of that because it's so well organized and it is what it is. It's also going to be interesting to watch the transformation of brick and mortar stores. Someone mentioned this the other day and I think it's true. We've seen such a decline of merchants in this country. We have a lot of stores, but we don't have a lot of merchants. I think it's just something to keep in the back of your mind in terms of where we might go in the next 5 to 10 years as brands become more comfortable with selling online. And then there's Vogue and what it has become. It's not just a magazine. Through Anna Wintour, it has reached into so many other areas. We all know the things that they do, but it's interesting too, in that you wonder if somehow a store can take up that approach. Stephen Moallem. Are there any holes or blind spots in fashion journalism that you'd like to see filled? Kathy Horn. I think the biggest hole is in criticism. I think that there should be more informed criticism. Part of the problem is that in the 1990s, the newspapers started losing their A section and department store advertising, and that paid for fashion writers and for the big feature space. You look at the kind of coverage that the Houston and Dallas papers used to give to fashion. At one point, there were 4 or 5 reporters from Texas at shows, and that's gone now, by the way. But those newspapers were training grounds, just like the Detroit News was for me. You'd get people who could be in the job for a long time and who understood the beat. I think that's what's missing today in a way. A lot of people come into writing about fashion because they love fashion, but they don't necessarily have the journalism skills. I'm a critic at the Times, but I've always felt that I'm just as much a reporter, and so I should do magazine pieces and profiles in what we call critics' notebooks. and reviews in the whole mixed bag. So I think there's room. And then I also think there's ample opportunity for people to do more reporting about the fashion companies and what's happening on the inside. There's a lot of reporting about products and events. We all do that pretty well, and maybe that's what a lot of readers want. There is that argument to be made for that. But because there is so much general commentary about fashion, there might be an opportunity for someone to do more investigative type reporting about the industry. You could do it on a blog. It'd be kind of lonely for a while. You'd have to be very committed to asking questions, and you couldn't be a front row presence. You couldn't care about that. It wouldn't be about that. But Paris and New York have a lot of people working in houses, and it's not hard to find out what's going on. That would be a great blog. I think that the industry over time would turn to that blog out of pure interest in knowing what's going on. As long as the person doing it was credible and accurate, I think there's room for that. End of interview. So I hope that you guys have exhumed a little bit of inspiration and understanding from a famous fashion journalist's perspective as to kind of the direction that criticism and fashion writing can go, as well as what might be the future of it. And so keep that in mind as you're crafting your features. And, she really emphasizes the importance of credibility and accuracy and not being afraid to be critical and to really do journalism when it comes to fashion, and that it's more than just loving fashion when it comes to writing. You really have to know your writing as well. Thank you, students. This is the end of our writing for newspaper section, and I will see you next time. Professor DiNardo signing off.